Alrighty, can I get a quick thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Fantastic. All right. So we finally managed to schedule this debate after numerous schedule conflicts, so I'm glad that we can get started. Okay, so on the motion that it should be illegal to own a fully automatic weapon, just to do a little bit of clarification about what I think I would like as a sort of baseline status quo for gun ownership, and then I can kind of go into some reasons why I think that owning a fully automatic weapon falls outside of those things. So as far as I can see, I think that there are a couple of legitimate reasons for wanting to own a gun. The first is some means of self-defense or otherwise deterrence against being attacked yourself. And the second thing would be for hunting, insofar as that some people use that to kind of supplement their income or indeed just find food for themselves. I think in both of those cases, handguns and hunting rifles are adequate to be able to fulfill those things. And so what I would like to see is that, broadly speaking, fully automatic weapons like assault rifles and submachine guns and things like that, I think fall outside and do not need to be owned by individuals. I would be happy, for example, to allow them to be owned by businesses such as gun ranges, so that if you wanted to shoot one, you could go there, rent it out for a period of time, and then use it there. But I'm also happy to take a harder burden and say that that's not something that should be allowed either, right? So just going into a couple of reasons about why I think this ban for individuals is appropriate. The first thing to note is that the two reasons that I outlined why I think gun ownership is legitimate, self-defense and hunting, are not made any easier or better by fully automatic weapons. So hunting, for example, you need something that's far more accurate, and I think that hunting rifles do a much better job for that. And in fact, if you use a fully automatic weapon to hunt, you would probably spoil whatever it is that you are trying to kill. If it is the case for self-defense, something that is more easily carried on your person and something that can be act as a deterrent is something that is adequate, and you do not need something that is fully automatic to be able to do that. And in fact, having something that is smaller that you are able to kind of carry on your person is probably something that is more reasonable than being expected to carry around a large rifle at all times. But I think the reasons why we should highlight automatic weapons as a way of harm reducing in terms of gun ownership is there are a couple of things that set automatic weapons aside from other kinds of guns. The first thing is to notice is that their rate of fire and higher magazine capacity means that, as we've seen with the Las Vegas shooting recently, if someone does want to do it to do a serious amount of damage to someone, they are much more able to do that with a fully automatic weapon than they are to do with a handgun or a hunting rifle. The second thing what I note here is that when someone has a high caliber rifle like that, it makes it much easier to for them to sort of fight against the police who are being called to that situation to try to stop it. So often things like assault rifles are able to pierce through bulletproof vests. So I think that if we're interested in still upholding the usefulness that people find from owning guns while trying to act some kind of harm minimization, I think that outlawing the most problem things makes sense. And I'll pass it now over to you.
Okay. Hey, good to finally see you. Sorry about all the mix-up this week. First, I'd like to address, I know you had stated it was for the sake of self-defense, and I'm sorry, I forgot the other reason. This is my first debate, so work with me here. But being from America, we within the Second Amendment rights, hunting. Thank you. Within the Second Amendment rights, the intent of that was not just for the sake of making sure that we had the right to defend ourselves from like home invaders and things like that, but it was also to help defend against like the idea of our own government turning on us. It was to give us equal force if need be. The second thing is I know you discussed the risk assessment with like how much damage could be done. Other types of weaponry have been used and created just as much damage. We see with like England, they've had the problems with all the bombings, and even in your country, Australia, they just had that massacre where the guy plowed through the shopping mall with his vehicle. That and even if we look at the statistics based on like homicide and rape, there hasn't been the American Medical Association just did a study where they looked through Australia's statistics on homicide and even suicide and determined that there's not enough evidence to determine whether or not these changes in laws have had any massive effect on how often these types of crimes happen and at what rate. And even like the the International Journal of Criminal Justice has stated the same thing, even though they openly admit that there's only been like fewer than 15 studies. None of these studies claim that there's any drastic change in the statistics on that kind of thing, specifically in Australia. England, I know they had banned a lot of those type of guns, but they also didn't. They've stayed around the same rate of violent crimes within their society. Like they've stayed at about a 1% per every million, like before and after they had changed their laws on that. And I think that's all I have for right now. I'm going to let you get back to what you have to say. How do I switch this over? I guess I'm going to wait for the time to go up because I don't know, and you can tell me then. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, there's a little button that says pass the mic that should just be under your profile that you can press. So mainly just dealing with the 2 points that you brought up about the usefulness of the Second Amendment and how it was originally intended to be written, and then also statistics about crime rate. So I'm aware that when the Second Amendment was first written, that the intention was to ensure a right for the population to hold arms so that they could defend themselves against a government if need be. This is one of the substantive points I actually want to bring up a bit later, so I'm glad we kind of led into it, is that I think that that particular interpretation of the Second Amendment as it exists today is something that is neither practical or valid. Because consider what that implies, right? Is that you want people to have guns so that if the US government started to crack down on rights and freedoms, you could overthrow them in some kind of violent revolt, right? For a country that spends billions and billions of dollars on its military, more money on its military than any other nation combined, the idea that a citizenship, even one armed with fully automatic weapons, would be able to fight against the tanks, the planes, the unarmed drone strikes that the US military has at its disposal is actually laughable, right? And even if there are like small subgroups that wanted to take that against that, right? So you have like, I would say that, the black population within certain parts of America that has a disproportionate amount of police violence inflicted upon them, right? Like that's a literal example of the state, oppressing them through the means of violence. If they were to take up arms against that population, people would lose their minds. It'd be an absurd thing to suggest that these people should conduct some kind of armed resurrection against the government. So I think that, that's not the mechanism that you can rely on to try to hold the government accountable. You need to recognize that any kind of armed insurrection would just be an unmitigated disaster for the people. And so, you just kind of have to rely on the mechanisms of democracy to hold the government accountable for that. So I think that that particular definition of the Second Amendment is not something that's really useful anymore. So, which is why I point to instead that the reason why people should own guns is valid in terms of self-defense and in hunting, and that arming yourself against the military is just not something that's practical. In regards to the crime rate statistics that you brought up, like, yes, this may be true that decreasing in these weapons is not going to have any change on the crime rate. But the point that I'm making is that when those crimes do occur, you can do a lot less damage with something like a handgun or a rifle than you can with an automatic weapon, right? Because the premise of an automatic weapon is they are designed to be more effective than a simple handgun or a simple hunting rifle. And I pointed to examples of features, things like higher magazine count, faster, firing rate and things like that. Like when you are someone who is armed with a fully automatic weapon, it is just true that you are able to take down more targets than when you are armed with a handgun that only has a magazine of about 6, right? That's something that's useful in a self-defense situation because all you really need is ideally you don't want to fire the gun, you just need to use it as a deterrent. But in a combat situation,
Okay. Am I going? Okay. First, to get into the idea that like we need to first discuss the idea that specifically in America, like fully automatic weapons, a good majority of them are already banned and well regulated, and that hasn't stopped like the amount of mass shootings. I mean, we've had more mass shootings now than you know before 1985, I believe, when we banned a good majority of those types of weapons. It is shown statistically that it hasn't changed the crime rate in those areas. Like, in fact, in what was it, the 19? I'm trying to remember when Columbine happened. 1999. they believe that crime rate was going to go up because of things like this, and we noticed here in America specifically that slowly, like, the crime rate, specifically in violent crimes, has went down due to that. And as far as with the Second Amendment and the fear of uh, you know, it seeming ridiculous, I can agree with some of what you're saying, but at the same time, like, I think it's not so ridiculous to believe in a time when people are so distrusting of government, why people would not want to just get rid of something like that. I can understand the aspect that, like, of why people would want to keep those weapons, believing that, I mean, if we look at a rampant, you know, conspiracy theories and other ridiculous ideas like that run, that it's not so impractical, people would fight to keep their right to bear these type of arms in case of that. So, like I said, I do agree with the idea that, like, it can be a conditional kind of like slippery slope when thinking of it in that way, and that it's even kind of but it's understandable to believe why people feel they need the right to own that in a fears its government so much. All right, I'm gonna try this passing over the mic again. I see the button this time.
Cool. Yeah, so I understand what you're saying in terms of like people might have a legitimate distrust of the government and want to try to hold on to their weapons to try to fight back against that. I think that if you're reading the Second Amendment as that is what it is meant to enshrine, that you're meant to have a armed population, and by the mechanism of them being armed, that is the thing that holds the government accountable. I think that just owning fully automatic weapons, as I've demonstrated, is not adequate for that, because like the government doesn't like, if you know, you had a military state that is trying to enforce its, you know, will on the population through a violent police state, right? It's not going to care that you have a couple of people armed with like fully automatic weapons when it can outfit its police with like literal military gear and things like, you know, tanks and all that other sort of stuff. So I think that if that's your interpretation of the Second Amendment and that's what you're relying on, then really you have to stand for things like average citizens owning things like missiles and drones that are capable of, because that's the only way that it's kept in check, right? When you have that both sides have a somewhat equal power level, and it's kind of like a mutually assured destruction if one side attacks the other, right? So that is the point that I'm making about why that particular interpretation of the Second Amendment in today's day and age, and you know, it made total sense when the framers wrote it, because they just came off a war with Britain where both sides were relatively equally armed, in terms of one side had muskets and a couple more cannons, but the other side could also get those muskets. So they were thinking, well, look, how can we ensure that we don't become the empire that we just defeated? Let's ensure that our citizens can always rise up. I don't think they predicted the vast advances in military technology that we see today, which is why that whole kind of paradigm just sort of breaks down and doesn't really work anymore. So I think that if that is the interpretation that you go, you have to sort of hold, you know, citizens as wanting to own things like missiles and drones, which obviously is something that is kind of untenable. So I think that that particular interpretation of the Second Amendment is not something that is valid in today's context. And because of that, I then think that my interpretations of needing it for self-defense or needing it for hunting are more legitimate, and which is why I would restrict it to weapons that are specifically useful and specifically designed for that purpose. And anything past that is something that I would particularly outlaw. Touching again just on the stuff that you mentioned about the crime rates, like I agree, banning these weapons probably isn't going to have an effect on the crime rate, but especially seeing as that it doesn't have an effect on the crime rate, that if we're going to maintain a similar crime rate that we have now, I think that it is wise to take steps to try to prevent the amount of damage that someone wants to do, right? Like the kids at Columbine armed themselves with semi-automatic machine guns. If they had just been armed with hand pistols instead, they probably have killed a lot less people before the police were able to arrive up and you know, stop the scene from happening. That is what I stand behind when I say that it's illegal to own a fully automatic weapon, because it saves lives by allowing people to do less damage.
Oh no. Again, I don't that taking away these guns, all you're doing in that case, if it's not genuinely having a effect on crime rates, is taking away individual rights from citizens who have done nothing wrong, essentially. Like, because like I said, we discussed the crime rates in countries that do have bans on it, and there's not much of a difference in the rate that they had before and the rate that they had after in those crimes. So by doing that, you're taking away the rights of individual citizens who have the right to bear these arms. And again, the missile thing, like the specific definition used for the right to bear arms, like under the legal definition that is used within the like Second Amendment, was the right to like bear firearms. So it again, the biggest problem I have, and I had already stated that like I find it ridiculous to think that somebody thinks that they could overthrow a government. In the same way, I think some protests go a little too far with thinking that their protest is going to do much of anything other than destroy property. But at the same time, I do feel individuals have the right to own these arms because it they're not a good majority of individuals aren't doing anything harmful with these weapons. I mean, but a good majority of the time, you said hunting was okay, but I mean, a good majority of mass shootings are done with hunting rifles. Like you had what the I think two of the Colorado incidents were done with hunting rifles. There was the Watchtower shooting in Texas that was done with hunting rifles, and a good majority of homicides and suicides are done with pistols. I understand the idea that you say that the rate of people killed in that would change, but again, look at England, who a good majority of the few massacres they've had lately were based on bombings, which took out like injured and took out like 200 people, and I think it injured 200 and something people and killed like the first one killed 47 people. Like it's not the mechanism is always going to change. One thing we need to start looking at more is again, I'm not against regulating weapons, but I am in the same way like we changed the way we look at how cars are. In the 1940s, cars were allowed on the same roads people walked on, and we changed regulations and have learned from that. Oh, I'm running out of time, so all right.
Oh, good. So yeah, so I think that you raised some reasonable point about rights, which is why I want to kind of draw the distinction. So the reason why I defined it as, the legitimate uses of owning guns as self-defense and hunting is because I think that ultimately that does actually guarantee a lot of the rights that the Second Amendment is set up to defend. Like the right to own a gun is meaningless without some kind of context, right? Like just, saying like I have a right to own this mug because I like mugs, right? Like, surely there has to be a reason why you want to own those mugs. And I outlined why I think those reasons for owning guns are, right? So if you think that you have a right to own a gun because you have a right to defend yourself, I think that that right is adequately satiated with owning a handgun. If you have a right to own a gun because you think you have a right to go out and hunt for your family in order to provide food, I think that right is adequately sated with owning a hunting rifle. If you have you say that you have a right because you have to own a fully automatic weapon because you just really like shooting fully automatic weapons, I already outlined that I would be fine for automatic weapons to be owned by businesses such as gun ranges, where you could go rent a period of time and fire down a target range. So I think like if you just want to use that for recreational purposes, I think that there are mechanisms that we can set up that still enable that, but vastly decrease the risks of these getting into hands of people who want to use them to kill high amounts of people. Because the important thing to notice about rights is that they are not unlimited. They obviously have to be balanced against other rights that exist. And I think that you bring up the example of cars really well, because those are something that we try to regulate. Those are something that we try to, put stopgaps in to ensure that people have licenses. And so I think that as long as we are able to fulfill the criteria and the necessary need for these rights, as I have outlined, then we are able to ban or outlaw fully automatic weapons, because I don't think that we are significantly infringing on those rights in doing so, right? You talked about that. Well, even if we did this, that the mechanisms that people would find in order to try to do harm to other people was still going to remain salient. You talked about like the bombing in England, right? Which I think is another example of how we try to, prevent against those things. Like when you buy a bunch of fertilizer that is known to have a bunch of compound to try to make a bomb, like if you buy that in a huge amount, like in places like Australia, huge warning bells go off and like your name gets submitted to a government agency who starts to try to keep tabs on you. We make it illegal to try to buy certain things that can access you in trying to build these things like bombs. So I think that, you know, in any sense, we should obviously try to guarantee the rights when they are necessary for people being able to do things that they are entitled to. But at the same time, we should take every precaution possible to make sure that people aren't able to build things that are capable of doing mass damage. So even if the crime rate doesn't go down in these particular instances, that it is harder for people at the very least to do things like build bombs or own fully automatic weapons that they used and that they are able to use to go into a crowd of people and then just massacre them indiscriminately.
But again, like I was saying, we highly regulated cars, but we allowed people to own them still. We didn't say, oh, because cars are a problem, you can only go to a place to rent a car and we're going to keep close tabs on it. Like, you're able to own a car, you have specific regulations you have to follow within owning that car. And there's a lot of restrictions on people that can own a car. I mean, I have a cousin that has seizures and she can't drive a car and get a license because of the fact that she has seizures and that affects her ability to be on the road and drive. I have no problem with the idea of regulating these and getting better vettings for these type of weapons. The idea of taking them away and saying you can only go to these places to get it, I think is ridiculous. Like, I do really feel that people have the right to own such weapons, even if specifically, like, I have a friend that is a collector of specifically semi-automatic weapons, not fully automatic, because a good majority of them you obviously can't get in this country. But by doing that, again, as I've said before, you are taking the individual right away because of a few choice individuals. And like I said, and I don't know if it was addressed and maybe I missed it, but the idea that with handguns, with suicide and even homicide rates, a good majority of those are handgun based, and a good majority of the massacres were done with hunting rifles. So both the weapon that you said that was for defense and the weapon that you said was for hunting were used in a good majority of those type of situations. So in that very essence, like, what do you think would be the best action if both of those have the higher rate than the assault rifle, which, number one, like, only a certain percentage of people own, and I believe last time I checked, I'll get back to you on that, like, in an email later, but I believe 5 to 6% of mass shootings are done with assault rifles, and I don't think there's been a single mass shooting that's been done with a fully automatic rifle because, number one, how inefficient they are, specifically in accuracy. You're just basically spraying and praying. But again, knowing that, like, I'm fully open to the idea of making regulations and having specific licensing on it. I'm not comfortable with the idea of taking the rights away from good citizens.
Cool. Okay. So I'll just respond to a couple of points that you brought up there, and then I'll make some closing statements. So, you brought up the point of, like, the regulation versus banning thing, where it's like, well, we still allow people to own cars. We don't, you know, and we regulate them. We don't outlaw them specifically, right? But there are limits on the types of cars that people are able to own, right? Like, there's certain amounts of modifications that you are not allowed to make to a vehicle because it would make it unroadworthy. Like, if you tried to build like a kind of Mad Max like death machine that had like 2 machine guns mounted on the front and a bunch of crazy stuff coming off it, whatever the governing body for cars in your country would probably go up and say, no, that's not something that's going on the road. I would say that fully automatic weapons and other things that are specifically designed to try to kill as many people as possible in a short amount of time are the equivalent of Mad Max cars, right? Like, we can guarantee the rights to owning to owning guns for useful purposes by in the mechanisms that I've outlined. I think that those specific types of guns, given that their only purpose is to try to kill as many people as possible within a short amount of time, I think fall into the type of category as something that we shouldn't allow, right? Secondly, you talked about your friend who collected these type of weapons. That's good. I think that the burden to fulfill to say that people have a right to collect things is probably just not as an important right for the government to enshrine. I already pointed out a couple of reasons why I think it's legitimate to own guns and why it's legitimate for the government to try to enshrine those rights. I don't think it, like, if something poses a serious risk to, like, I don't have a right to collect plutonium just because I like plutonium, but even because it poses a huge stress to public safety. That's not something that a reasonable government has to enforce. Last thing you want to talk about is like the idea that handguns and rifles are still used in a majority of homicides, suicides, and other mass shootings. The point that I would like to bring up here is that as I've analyzed, like, you probably can't change the crime rate just by inflicting this, but it is true that you can just do a lot less damage, right? Because in the case where, you know, the whole reason why a automatic weapon or a semi-automatic or a fully automatic weapon is developed is because it is meant to be more efficient at spraying out more bullets than something as simple like a handgun or a rifle. So, you know, someone who is equipped in a massacre situation with that kind of weapon is just able to do more damage. And the facts like the higher caliber of the gun and the facts that they are able to take out more people and go for a longer time without having to reload, that is something that means that the police are able to intervene more easily, which means it is more able to determine you know, when you are able to interfere with those things. And so that is something that is going to be more effective at stopping those people who do commit those mass shootings while ensuring they're able to do as least damage as possible before being stopped by the police. So in closing, I'd just like to bring their points. I think that there are legitimate reasons that the government should enshrine the right to gun ownership, as I outlined, self-defense and hunting. I think both of those rights are adequately satisfied when you allow people to own handguns and rifles. I don't think that virtually any other type of gun, including semi-automatic, fully automatic, or things like that, is something that we need in order to be able to preserve those rights. And so therefore, I think they should be banned.